In 1882, the last confirmed sighting of the black-naped pheasant-pigeon was recorded, a single bird, seen briefly in the dense forests of Ferguson Island in the remote waters of Papua New Guinea, and then nothing. Not a single confirmed sighting, not a photograph, not a feather, not a sound. For 127 years, this bird simply did not exist. Scientists classified it as almost certainly extinct. Conservation organizations listed it as one of the most wanted lost birds on Earth. People who dedicated their careers to finding it came back with nothing. Expedition after expedition, decade after decade, nothing. And then in 2019, a local hunter in Papua New Guinea mentioned something to a visiting researcher. Casually, almost as an afterthought, he described a bird he had seen in the forest, a bird he called by its local name, a name that made the researcher's hands go cold. Because that local name matched a bird that science had not seen in 127 years. The researcher organized an expedition immediately. They went into the forest, and they found it, alive, in the same forest where it had last been seen more than a century before. But the question that has haunted scientists ever since is not where it was found. It is where it had been. For 127 years, this bird existed, somewhere, hidden from every expedition, every researcher, every conservation effort. How does a bird survive for 127 years without being seen by a single scientist? And what does that tell us about how much of the natural world we still do not know? Today, we are going inside one of the greatest wildlife mysteries of the modern era: the disappearance, the search, the rediscovery, and the question nobody has fully answered yet. By the end of this video, you will look at the world's forests very differently. Let us start at the beginning. Ferguson Island, one of the D'Entrecasteaux Islands, off the eastern tip of Papua New Guinea, one of the most remote and least studied places on Earth. Dense tropical forest covering steep volcanic terrain, almost no roads, almost no infrastructure, and a biodiversity so extraordinary that scientists who visit describe it as one of the last truly wild places remaining. In 1882, a naturalist named William Doherty collected a specimen of an extraordinary bird on Ferguson Island. A large ground-dwelling pigeon with an iridescent black cap on its head, rich brown and chestnut plumage, eyes of a striking orange-red, unlike anything previously described by science. He named it, documented it, and returned home. And that was it. No follow-up expedition returned to document more specimens. No photographs were taken. No behavior was recorded. One specimen, one location, 1 year, and then 127 years of silence. In the early 20th century, ornithologists periodically attempted to relocate the species. They found nothing. As the decades passed, and the attempts multiplied without success, the scientific consensus gradually shifted. The black-naped pheasant-pigeon was probably extinct, another casualty of habitat loss, of hunting pressure, of the relentless human pressure on the world's remaining wild places. It joined a long and heartbreaking list. The dodo, the passenger pigeon, the great auk, species that had existed for millions of years, and then simply weren't there anymore. The black-naped pheasant-pigeon was added to the list of the probably gone, and the world moved on. But not everyone accepted the silence. In the early 2000s, a global initiative began to document and search for what scientists called the world's lost birds, species that had not been confirmed in decades, or, in some cases, over a century. The black-naped pheasant-pigeon was on the list, listed as one of the most wanted, one of the most critical, and one of the least likely to be rediscovered, because of where it lived. Ferguson Island is not a place you simply visit. There are no tourist facilities, no easy access. The terrain is brutal. The forest is dense. the isolation is complete. Multiple researchers who considered expeditions to search for it concluded that the logistical challenges were simply too great, the probability of success too low, and so the search was repeatedly deferred, year after year, until 2019, when a researcher named Jordan Boersma was conducting fieldwork on Ferguson Island, focused on entirely different species, and stopped to talk to a local hunter named Agostino Gregory. Agostino mentioned, almost in passing, that there was a bird in the forest that local people called by a particular name, a bird he and others had seen, a large ground-dwelling bird with a black cap. Boersma later described the moment he heard the description. He said it felt like the ground shifted under him, because the bird Agostino was describing matched the black-naped pheasant-pigeon. Exactly. Boersma contacted the American Bird Conservancy immediately. An expedition was organized, a team assembled, and in late 2022, they went into the forest of Ferguson Island, looking for a bird that science had not confirmed in 127 years. The expedition faced immediate challenges. The terrain was exactly as brutal as expected. Steep forested ridges, no paths, dense undergrowth, rain, and the fundamental problem of searching for a rare ground-dwelling bird. In one of the densest forests on Earth, they set camera traps, dozens of them, positioned across the forest at locations suggested by local knowledge. Because here is something that the scientific community has increasingly come to understand. In places where Western science has little presence, local indigenous knowledge often holds information that no expedition has ever recorded. Agostino Gregory and other local hunters knew this bird, had always known it, had names for it, had tracked it, had encountered it in the forest. While science had listed it as probably extinct, the people who actually lived in this forest had been seeing it all along. The camera traps ran for weeks. The team checked them regularly, finding footage of other species. Extraordinary biodiversity captured on those cameras, but not the bird they were looking for. And then one morning, reviewing footage from a camera positioned on a ridge at high elevation, a researcher stopped, rewound, watched again, and called the rest of the team over. On the screen, walking calmly through the undergrowth, was the black-naped pheasant-pigeon, alive, documented, for the first time in 127 years. If this is giving you chills right now, hit like so more people can discover this incredible story. The footage was extraordinary. The bird was clearly healthy, moving confidently through its forest habitat, behaving exactly as a ground-dwelling pigeon should, completely unaware that it had just ended 127 years of scientific mystery. The discovery made international news. Conservation organizations celebrated. Scientists who had spent careers working on lost species described it as one of the most significant rediscoveries of the century, and then the questions began. Where had it been? Not metaphorically, literally. Where had a population of birds been living for 127 years without being documented by a single scientific expedition? The answer is more disturbing than most people realize. It had been exactly where it always was, in the forests of Ferguson Island, in the same habitat, living the same life, doing what it had always done. The bird hadn't gone anywhere. Science had simply never looked hard enough, or in the right way. The terrain was too difficult, the expeditions too brief, the scientific presence too limited, and crucially, the knowledge held by local people had never been properly sought or recorded. Agostino Gregory knew this bird existed, had always known. His community had always known, but nobody asked them for 127 years. Nobody asked the people who actually lived in the forest. When researchers finally asked, they found the bird within months. This is a pattern that has repeated itself across wildlife rediscoveries around the world. Species declared extinct or lost by Western science that local indigenous communities had knowledge of all along. The Jackson's climbing salamander in Guatemala, the Wandiwoi tree kangaroo in Indonesia, the Somali sengi in Africa. In case after case, local knowledge held the answer that years of scientific expeditions had failed to find. The rediscovery of the black-naped pheasant-pigeon raised a question that scientists are still sitting with. If this bird survived for 127 years without scientific detection, what else is out there? The honest answer is that nobody knows. There are currently hundreds of bird species classified as lost, not confirmed extinct, but not confirmed alive either, somewhere between those two categories, existing in a scientific limbo, listed as probably gone, but not proven gone. And the Ferguson Island discovery suggests something important. Probably gone is not the same as gone. Researchers working on lost species have intensified their efforts since 2022, using exactly the approach that found the pheasant-pigeon, building relationships with local communities first, asking the people who actually live in these forests what they know, recording indigenous names and descriptions, cross-referencing with historical scientific records. And in multiple cases since 2022, this approach has led to rediscoveries of species that science had given up on. The world's forests are larger than our ability to fully search them. The world's biodiversity is greater than our current records capture. And somewhere in the forests that scientists have not properly searched, possibly in the forests that indigenous communities already know intimately, there are birds that have been living quietly through the decades, waiting to be found, not because they were hiding, but because nobody asked the right people. 127 years. A bird that science had given up on, living in the same forest, doing what it had always done, while expedition after expedition searched and found nothing, while conservation lists marked it as probably gone, while the world assumed the silence meant absence. The silence didn't mean absence. It meant we weren't listening in the right way, to the right people, in the right places. The black-naped pheasant-pigeon is still there, in the forests of Ferguson Island, living the life it has always lived, unaware of its own fame, unaware of the 127 years of searching, unaware that its rediscovery changed how scientists approach the search for lost species worldwide. And perhaps the most important thing its story tells us is not about birds. It is about knowledge, about who holds it, and about what we miss when we fail to ask the people who have always been there. The forest knew where the bird was. The people in the forest knew where the bird was. We simply needed to ask. If this story changed the way you think about what might still be out there, subscribe to Birdhearts so you never miss another incredible bird mystery, and tell me in the comments, which lost bird do you think is still out there waiting to be found? I'll see you in the next one.